So go ahead, Irv, introduce yourself. Tell me, how long have you been a peace activist?
I've been a peace activist all of my life, in one way or another, because I came from a community that valued the ethic of social involvement. So, as I grew up, from childhood on, I had a belief that activism, from a social activist point of view, was a desirable way of spending one's life.
Your mother teach you that?
No, the community that I lived in. I lived in a commune that had some 5,000 or so people in the northeast part of the Bronx. And the commune, with hundreds of apartments, had a constituency of people that came from Europe and from other parts of the United States that were concerned about social issues. And this was the community ethic that I was born into and lived there for some 16 years. There were a few thousand people who came together, donated their own personal funds to build an apartment complex that housed a few thousand people. Most of the people came there into that complex because of a belief that social activism was a way to help make society better. People that lived there came primarily from backgrounds that involved support for socialist and communist activities in that period of time.
So, as a result of where you are now, cut to the present, what are you involved with now? And what organizations that you started are you still involved with? And what organizations that you were part of that are no longer there? How did all this?
So I came through a generation of decades of involvement in things from childhood, supporting people that were supporting democracy in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, people that were involved as a community in fighting against fascism during the Second World War, and moving on from there to the civil rights movement and movements involving other forms of activism in the period just following the Second World War. And then went into the service and became involved in, upon release from the Army, I became involved in civil rights movement and helped to create a few organizations in the San Gabriel Valley, Council on Discrimination, and the Mississippi Assistance Project, which were basically two projects that supported the civil rights movement that took place in the late 50s and early 60s. And starting in 1965, I became involved in the movement of concern with American foreign policy in Southeast Asia, which then ultimately became what is known as the Vietnam War. And I helped to found an organization called the Peace Action Council. That council brought together over 100 peace organizations that cooperatively focused their energy on educating people about the fact that that war was a war that did not have to be fought, that caused the deaths of 60,000 young Americans and 3 million Vietnamese over a period of 7 or 8 years of American involvement. And when that was over, in 1972-73, I became involved in what is now known as the environmental movement, and helped to create an organization called the Alliance for Survival, which actually still functions in a number of locations, Santa Monica and in Orange County. And then in the late 70s, I became aware that most people in our country did not know about the work of the United Nations in regards to many of the issues that I was concerned about: hunger, poverty, refugees, sexism, racism. And the UN was involved in all of these issues at the international level and doing positive things to work on those issues. When I realized that people knew almost nothing about what the UN was doing in that regard, I became very involved in a number of activities geared to educating people in our country and then ultimately in other countries about the work of the United Nations to overcome poverty, help to prevent war, to overcome the racism and sexism that grew out of the colonial period and a prehistory of our country and the world.
Now, were you ever discouraged that all of this effort wasn't achieving goals, or did you feel that you were achieving goals?
No, at every point I felt that all the things that I was involved in ultimately ended up being achieved. It was sort of a spiral effect. Sometimes it went up and sometimes it went a little bit down, but it was always on an ascendancy, so that today, even though there are remnants of colonialism, most of the colonial empire has dissipated. In 1948, the United Nations was involved in the development of a document called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which even today is probably the most important document or effort that the UN was involved in the promotion of basic human rights. And it happened in 1948 when the document was formed. One has to remember that in 1948, there were 13 states in the United States. In the United States, where many poor people and black people did not have the right to vote. And it took, after 1948, almost a decade before those rights would be guaranteed to our own people. Yet in 1948, the United Nations proclaimed the right to vote as a fundamental basic human right, and the commission that formulated that concept was chaired by the wife of the President of the United States, Eleanor Roosevelt. So you can see that even though things happen at one period, and they're good things, that sometimes it takes many years for those things to actually be enacted and be put into the realm of reality.